Hello and welcome to hashtag Rights Not Bribes, our Google Plus Hangout today on the human rights case against corruption. I'm Craig Mokhiber with the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we're coming to you live from Geneva, Switzerland. We're joined today by a number of partners who have something important to say about this subject, and from people all around the world who are following us either on our hashtag Rights Not Bribes, following us live on Twitter and on Facebook as well. But first, let me give a warm welcome to all of the participants who will be speaking with us today and ask them to introduce themselves. Gareth, can we start with you?
Yes, hello, my name is Gareth Sweeney and I'm the Chief Editor for the Global Corruption Report at Transparency International, and I'm calling you from Berlin, Germany.
Thank you, Gareth. Now over to Mexico.
I'm Justine Dupuy, and I'm a researcher in Fundar Analysis and Research Center. It's a Mexican NGO created in 1999, and we are working to promote human rights and democracy through transparency, access to information, accountability. Corruption is a transverse field for us.
Indeed it is. Now, thank you, Justine. Let's go over to Anwar from Tunisia.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Anwar Khalifa. I am investigator-in-chief in the National Anti-Corruption Commission in Tunisia, which is the first independent body dealing with embezzlement and corruption in terms of prevention and investigation. I'm connecting from Tunisia.
Welcome, Anwar. Let me also welcome Shaazka from the United States of America.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shaazka Beyerle. I'm a member of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption Civil Society Coalition. I'm also an independent researcher, writer on people power and how citizens can nonviolently fight for their rights.
Terrific. Welcome to you as well. And of course, as I say, we've got people joining us from all around the world via Facebook and Twitter and the United Nations webpage as well. Remember, it's hashtag Rights Not Bribes for our Google Plus Hangout today. And we are live tweeting on Twitter with the mark at RightsWire. So we'll be expecting some input from all of you who are following us online as well. Well, because it is illicit, because it happens in the shadows, we really don't know the full scope of corruption all around the world. But we know that the magnitude is significant, and we know that it affects human rights in very direct ways that we'll talk about today. We know that every year some US $1 trillion are paid in bribes around the world. Estimated that 2.6 trillion US dollars are actually stolen annually. That's enough to feed all of the world's hungry 80 times over. There's a direct impact on human rights that should leave little doubt. And we know that corruption always hits the poorest and most vulnerable in societies around the world. So let's take a closer look at this issue. Justine, can you tell us a little bit about how you see corruption affecting the rights of the people that you work with?
Yes, I've got a concrete example on the impact the corruption has on the right to health. In 2004, Mexico launched El Seguro Popular. It's a government funding and a public medical insurance program. And the aim of this program is to ensure universal access to health. Fundar was monitoring the medical purchase, the purchase of medicine. And what do we found? That the states paid twice or 3 times the price of the medicine, or they bought medicine they do not need. So there is a direct impact on the people's right to health, because although Mexico is trying to ensure universal access to health through the Seguro Popular, in 2013, nowadays, 30% of the members of the Seguro Popular do not receive the medicine they need. And in poorest states, like the south states of Mexico, like in Guerrero, this percentage is more important. 40% do not have the medicine, do not receive this medicine. And in Michoacan, for example, it's like 60% of the people. So there is a direct impact of people's right to health.
That is a direct impact on a human right. After all, the right to health is guaranteed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and a host of other international human rights instruments. We're also getting tweets here suggesting that not only is corruption impacting on economic and social rights like health, but also on civil and political rights because of corruption in the judiciary or corruption in electoral processes. Not to mention, as some are tweeting us, corruption in the private sector. Let me ask Shaazka and Anwar to give us some of their views and experiences on this one. Shaazka.
Well, we have to remember that corruption breeds impunity, and impunity is at the heart of human rights violations. So, for example, when someone goes to court and they have to pay a bribe, that is the denial of the judicial process of justice. When courts collude with the private sector, with other parts of the government in order to, for example, displace people from their land or steal assets that belong to the state, which ultimately is the citizenry, that's corruption and a denial of human rights. So this is happening all over the world. Then you have cases of police extorting citizens for money. That happens all over the world, from Africa to Asia to the former Soviet Union. The good news is that actually people can fight this using nonviolent methods in grassroots campaigns and movements.
Well, that's a good message. We have to fight it, don't we, if it's impacting on human rights? And you're right, it's happening all over the world, but I have a feeling, as the eyes of the world have been glued on Tunisia in recent years, that Anwar may have some experience in this area as well. Anwar.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, as you know, Tunisia has a special context. So after the fall of the former regime, the citizens and the whole population discovered that many sectors, and they would say the whole society, was affected by the negative effects and impact of corruption. So the judicial branch was one of the sectors that were the most affected by this phenomenon. So preventing citizens from their right to a fair justice. So in our work in the National Anti-Corruption Commission, we discovered that politicians, among them the former president, gave direct instructions to judge. So we could actually conclude that the judicial branch had no independence. So besides, we investigated in some cases where relatives of the former president were authorized by the judiciary to build buildings in historical sites, like, for example, in Carthage, which was very dramatic for the whole population in Tunisia.
The whole population in Tunisia, to be sure, and you know, lots of newfound transparency now in Tunisia, thanks to all these good citizen efforts that are taking place. But it has to be said, of course, that corruption is a global phenomenon, not just limited to Tunisia and its neighbors, but found all around the world. Let's try to get a big picture. Let's try to get the global picture on this. Gareth, can you paint that picture for us? How are the trends globally?
Sure. Well, it's difficult. It's perhaps easier to talk about trends in the global response to corruption than global trends in corruption itself, because corruption, like human rights, exists in all countries, in all sectors. As long as there is absence of transparency, absence of oversight mechanisms and accountability mechanisms, and lack of opportunity for redress or protection of whistleblowers, anti-corruption activists, human rights defenders, then corruption and the risk of human rights violations are often equal. Certainly in terms of external trends, we at Transparency International would see the effects of corruption and the link, as has been mentioned by my colleagues, crossing all human rights, civil, political, economic, social, and cultural. We see an increased intersection between government and business in transport, defense, energy, procurement, etc. And this brings an increasingly transnational character to forms of corruption. And again, I see a parallel with human rights and the efforts that are being made in addressing human rights responsibilities of business. So there are many parallels. But I think the more interesting area for us is our growing trends in how people are responding to corruption, and I emphasize people. We see, of course, evolving international instruments and demand for increased transparency, access to information, and so forth. But I think since the Arab Spring and in the last 12 months with various public protests, we see protests that are driven as much or equally by a refusal to accept corruption as much as human rights violations. Public movements don't distinguish, and nor, I believe, should we. And I think institutions, civil society should now see the bringing together of the anti-corruption strategies and human rights strategies. From a corruption standpoint, we would welcome the opportunity to engage more in human rights in order to move away from this more traditional conception of corruption as affecting development, economic and social development, and much more towards a people-centered approach. And this, I believe, is the true strength of the human rights framework.
I think you're right. It's kind of a natural marriage, isn't it, Gareth, that you have on the one side people who are struggling to promote human rights, on the other side those who are fighting against corruption. You've, I think, outlined for us very well the way they impact, you and the other panelists, the way they impact on each other. And I think your suggestion here that because these, like human rights, are universal, these problems, because they touch on the full spectrum of human rights, as you have said, we also need a human rights response here. And I think if you look at the principles that cut across both of these movements, principles like accountability and transparency, participation and non-discrimination, and making sure that these things are controlled under the rule of law in a way which is fair and credible, I think those are messages that come very much from human rights principles that apply equally to the struggle against corruption. So a very good marriage there of those two concepts from Gareth. Thank you very much for that indeed. That's kind of the global picture. What I'd like to suggest now is that we hear a little bit from our panelists as well on some best practices. What's happening on the ground? This switch over, as suggested by Gareth, to what people are doing to fight against this phenomenon of corruption because of its impact on human rights, and to do so in ways that are respectful of human rights. Let's hear from the panelists. Best practices.
I've got one best practices on how transparency, participation and access to information can be a very strong tool to fight corruption. In 2002 in Mexico, 30 million pesos, it's like $2.5 million, was allocated, normally had to be allocated to HIV prevention program, and it was allocated to an NGO. The name is pro-life. So civil society started to investigate, and through access to information, they just asked for the receipt. And they found that the money was spent by this NGO to buy fonts. So that's why we said it was the fonts gate, and then buy luxury items. So because of its work, the health ministry asked the pro-life to return the money. And last year, 10 years after this media scandal, they put in jail the director of the foundation.
Well, there's some action on the ground. Other examples?
I can share an example if you'd like, Craig.
Please.
One, I would call this a lesson learned about how to effectively impact corruption and gain human rights, has to do with this practice of monitoring different kinds of activities of power holders, basically monitoring power holders. And there are examples around the world, but there's a very interesting one from Kenya that was launched by a group in Mombasa called Muslims for Human Rights. And in fact, they have engaged, they work with communities. Communities themselves initiate very comprehensive monitoring campaigns to monitor how funds are spent that are supposed to be going towards anti-poverty programs on the ground in the poorest communities in Mombasa and throughout Kenya. And so this concept of monitoring can be applied to police corruption and extortion, to how funds are spent, to, in Afghanistan, courts are being monitored by citizens in order to prevent corruption in the judicial system. So I think we can learn a lot that when you start watching something, when you watch power holders, then the system of corruption is disrupted. And that's a way to impact corruption and to gain human rights.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting. The example you give was a human rights organization already operating on the ground that picked up the cause directly of monitoring and accountability for corruption, again, showing the happy marriage between these concepts. Let's open up the conversation a little bit here because we are receiving some questions from people who are following us online. I've got one first here from Facebook where Victor has written in to say that corruption was also the source of the global economic crisis. No doubt many who have analyzed the economic crisis would agree with Victor because they have pointed out that a part of the problem was a lack of transparency, a lack of accountability in the international financial system. Is this something that any of you see as a broader problem? You know, is it always the case where there is a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability that we're opening ourselves up to corruption even on a global scale?
Well, maybe I'll just intervene to say that I think Victor has answered his own question. I would concur with his view. Not only was the financial crisis a gross failure in regulation and transparency, but I think one of the strengths of the human rights-based approach as well is the requirement that we adequately prepare, that we plan for these eventualities. It clearly has had impact on the rights of citizens, well, global citizens. But I think it illustrated that in the scale that it took people by surprise, that there was a lack of adequate planning, and this in itself raises questions about states' commitment to realize certain rights.
No, absolutely. Well, we've got another one here. Let me share it with you as well, coming to us on Twitter from Asif. Asif is written to say, to describe a situation often encountered on the ground. Asif says, when you're required to pay a bribe to get what you need, such as basic services, you pay the bribe to get those basic services that you need, but in effect, you're denying someone else their rights. What can we do, says Asif from Twitter.
Well, I think that not always the easiest thing is something true or something good to do. I think that our strategy to fight corruption must be a multi-dimensional strategy. It must be a holistic strategy that integrate, especially, and I want to highlight this aspect, that it must integrate the cultural element. So in order to encourage kind of spontaneous behavior of the citizen. I know that it is not easy, but we have to help citizens not only through official ways, but through cultural encouragement to fight corruption and to prevent himself from giving bribery.
Absolutely.
If I could add to Anwar's comments, I think that there's a very interesting example of how citizens are actually refusing to pay bribes in India. There is a movement called the Fifth Pillar Movement that originated in Tamil Nadu. And through something called the zero rupee currency, they empower communities and empower people to refuse to pay bribes in public administration offices by handing out the zero rupee currency note instead. Now, it's not one person doing this, because one person alone will be scared. But by handing out the zero rupee currency, that means that that person is backed by an entire social movement that in a way empowers that person and gives that person courage to do that. They also leaflet public offices where they list the actual prices for obtaining different things like driver's licenses and titles to land and things like that, so that when people go into the offices, they actually have the leaflet and they know what they're supposed to pay versus what the bribe amount is.
The right to information, isn't it? Yeah. Or put another way, knowledge is power. Yes, I heard somebody else trying to.
Yeah, if I could just jump in as well, and just to add to that, I mean, we have hundreds of examples of very innovative local approaches to dealing with bribery, to having to pay bribes for the most simple things. The Indian example is excellent, but another more one that has adapted new media, and this is particularly where we've seen an explosion is in use of social media and new media, is the I paid a bribe movement in India, where people simply post on I paid a bribe when they had to pay a bribe, and the readership of this website is enormous and has had significant consequence for those who've requested bribes and for institutions and so forth. So it has an enormous social or peer pressure effect as well.
It's remarkable, isn't it, the way social media is helping to increase levels of transparency directly from the people on the ground without going through officialdom, as it were, and the power that that's bringing also to enhance accountability. I heard another voice there. Go on and jump in.
For example, in Fundar, one of the most recent example we use of success. During 18 months, Fundar staff has worked to create a broad database about who receive agricultural subsidies. So, through technological tools, we transparent the farm subsidies, and we promote a public debate. And we can also found, for example, that civil servants were receiving this kind of subsidies, or narco trafficker, drug trafficker, excuse me, were receiving this subsidy. So, using technology, new technology, it's also a very strong tool to fight corruption.
Absolutely. And this also goes more to the question that we started to answer, because we had a question from Ahmed on Twitter who exactly asked about best practices and what's happening on the ground and what people are doing to combat this. So we started out with a number of interesting examples, have moved into how people are even using social media to push back against this phenomenon, and in the process, I think, defending their rights. I should say, after that very interesting example that we had from India, that we were joined originally by another person here who we can see visually, which is Sangeetha. Sangeetha from the Best Practices Foundation and a member of the Huairou Commission in India. Sangeetha, I think, do we have audio yet or not? So Sangeetha's joining us, but unfortunately, as you can see, because of technical problems, we are not able to hear the audio, but she is following and participating, and I guarantee, Sangeetha, on the next one we're going to get your voice into this thing. Apologies for the technical problems as well. Well, I think at this stage what we want to do, as we're approaching the end of our Hangout, is to have an opportunity to hear from each one of you on a takeaway. What for you is the most fundamental point that we need to make about the human rights case against corruption? And as you're thinking about that, let me just share with you another message that has come in on Google Plus from Natalie. Natalie asked about the rule of law and transparency, and she wants to know, how do we demand that the rule of law and transparency are applied? First, how do we make our demands heard? And secondly, how do we make sure that it's actually there? I'll give anyone who wants to try to respond to that point an opportunity to do so now, and then we're going to go into a last word from each one of you to conclude. Who wants to answer Natalie?
Well, I can just add something, Craig. The way we demand is that we collectively raise our voices together and to power holders, and we use nonviolent actions to create social pressure and to disrupt the corrupt and abusive practices that are going on. And if I could just say, I'm publishing a book on this this year, and there will be examples from all over the world of how citizens are doing just that thing.
That's fascinating. We'll look forward to that as well for more interesting examples. And anyone else have some guidance for Natalia on this? I guess shining a light, as we've just heard, is the first thing, to make sure these things are not happening in the shadows, working together and speaking up as well. But this is a perfect opportunity now, I think, for all of our participants to give us one last word on what we need to do to take this cause forward, and what is the take-home point here on the human rights case against corruption. Anwar, would you like to start?
Sure. Actually, I want to highlight that the fact that corruption is not a destiny, that it must be considered as everyone's concern, and that in order to enjoy human rights, citizens in all countries all over the world have to assume their duty first to fight corruption.
Absolutely, it's a duty of all of us, isn't it, to fight back? Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Gareth.
Well, my one takeaway, I hope, is that we've existed for too long with these separate tracks, two parallel tracks of the human rights movement and anti-corruption movement. And while, of course, there are differences and there are different approaches, ultimately our objectives are the same, which is to improve the rule of law, good governance, and social justice. And I hope that, consistent with the demands of people, as we've seen, that we as civil society and that states that represent us can bridge that divide. I'm aware, of course, that the Human Rights Council is discussing this next week, and I hope that we can see an outcome from these institutions that recognizes that we have a collective and shared responsibility.
Good advice and a shared hope. Justine.
Yes, I think human rights approach to anti-corruption agenda add values and improve the design and the implementation of anti-corruption policy, and they put in the center people, the society, so they are taking into account the impacts on individual rights.
Absolutely. Over to you, Shaazka, for a final thought.
Well, corruption involves the abuse of power, and human rights violations involve the abuse of power. And I would just read you one sentence that Aruna Roy, the great Indian nonviolent activist, said. Corruption is the external manifestation of the denial of a right, an entitlement, a wage, a medicine. That's how the two come together.
Great final words. I'll only top them off with a comment that we've just received on Twitter as well from Aida. Aida says, corruption isn't just about stealing money, it's about stealing rights from others. I think that's a fair point and a good way to sum up what we're saying. So we've seen today that corruption and human rights have a tremendous impact on each other. We've seen the importance of using human rights-based approaches to fight corruption, focused on things like transparency, accountability, non-discrimination, empowerment of local people to raise the issue themselves, including through innovative means like social media. And we've also seen that where corruption is unchecked, it can impact directly on the realization of people's rights, economic and social rights like health, but also on things like fair trial, free and fair elections, or just doing business on a daily basis in ways that are fair and just and transparent and open. We're going to keep the conversation going on this subject. You can watch it as well on YouTube, where we'll be posting the video of this discussion afterwards. Stay tuned as well, because the UN Human Rights Council, is mentioned on Wednesday, 13 March, at noon Central European Time, is going to be having a panel discussion precisely on the topic of human rights and corruption. And keep an eye on #RightsNotBribes to follow the conversation further. For the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for all of our panelists and all of you who participated on social media today, thank you very much. I'm Craig Mokhiber for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Thank you.